Thank you for listening to SPN, the Savage Podcasting Network.
You're listening to The Stephen Savage Show on the Savage Podcasting Network. And now here's your host, film and television director, Stephen Savage.
Thank you, Andrea, and welcome everyone to another episode of The Stephen Savage Show, the official podcast of the Idlewild International Festival of Cinema and the Scotland International Festival of Cinema. Today we're presenting one of our popular Fatal Gothic editions of the show, the episode entitled The Wicked Lady Skelton. And here to help me introduce the episode is my podcast partner in crime, Julia Parker. Julia, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing great in my new studio and enjoying the first day of fall.
And you're in Marina Del Rey. You're in a great place, especially with all the hot weather in Los Angeles. You might as well be on the ocean, huh?
We're about to get some more, so yeah, this weekend's going to be a hot one.
Well, this episode deals with the case of Lady Catherine Ferrers, a well-to-do noblewoman who lived in England in the 17th century, who, due to the socialist government mandates of Oliver Cromwell against the British nobility shortly after the beheading of King Charles I, was subjected to forfeiture of lands and rents, and therefore all of their incomes. So many nobles were driven to crime and began robbing cash wagons and travelers on the main road that ran between London and Birmingham. They were known as the Highwaymen, and Catherine Ferrers joined their ranks and became known as the Wicked Lady Skelton, a name that brought terror to the British countryside in the mid-1600s, until she met her death by gunfire doing one of her many robberies. Julia, I know Catherine has become something of a feminist heroine in the past centuries, but you have a slightly different take after some extensive research. Am I right?
I do. Heroine is hardly the word to describe Catherine Ferrers. In fact, though her exploits would at first look seem like grand adventures, she was really no more than a common thief and murderer. And the term serial killer, no matter what spin you try and put on it, fits her to a T. She murdered everyone who stood in her way, and though she, like other nobles of her time, might have been driven to lives of crime from Cromwell's sanctions against them, murder was not a common element of their bad deeds. Yet, Catherine not only excelled at murder, she actually seemed to enjoy it. And as a sole female highwayman, she was by far the most notorious. So murder and theft were her stock in trade, and she grew rich by taking whatever she wished, as often as she wished. In all, not a very good person, to say the least.
as this episode will attest to. So, any historic light turned on Catherine's exploits that makes her seem heroic in any way, Julia's right, is misguided and revisionist claptrap. But we'll let our listeners judge for themselves how much of a heroine she was as we present Fatal Gothic, The Wicked Lady Skelton. Shall we, Julia?
Let's do it.
All right. Enjoy, everyone.
This is Fatal Gothic. Case histories of pre-20th century serial killers, long hidden in the dark corners of time. Serial killer. A term coined by FBI agents in the 1970s to describe one who kills randomly, kills strangers, over a period of weeks or months or even years. But serial murder was not a 20th century phenomenon alone. Far back in the annals of time, before Jack the Ripper or H.H. Holmes, every country throughout recorded history has experienced the horror of senseless murder perpetrated by a killer without a face. My co-host for the podcast is film and television director Stephen Savage.
And my co-host is actress, voiceover artist, and television personality Julia Parker. England, 1657. John Hastings had been a carriage guard his entire adult life. His father as well had been a carriage guard, and both father and son were trusted bondsmen, hired often by the London Royal Exchange and large business interests to protect the strong boxes on the heavy wagons that carried gold and silver payroll to the outskirts of the British Kingdom, where workers toiled in such hard physical labor as iron ore and coal mining. These were the days before the first proper banks were established in England, and the system of transporting hard currency in this manner was quite common, and also dangerous, as robbers and thieves, known as highwaymen, were everywhere, hiding in the woods that lined the narrow commerce roads, just waiting for a juicy payroll wagon to come along. Royal horsemen accompanied the wagons to protect valuable shipments when those shipments were ordered by the Crown or Parliament, but simple hired men-at-arms were utilized for private business transport such as this particular one, and often these men themselves were corrupt and would, for a percentage, get word to bandits of large transports of cash heading in their direction. It truly was a haphazard business, but it was trustworthy and well-vetted men like John Hastings who, with musket and flintlock pistols in hand, sat atop the wagons with strong boxes full of gold and silver under the seats beneath them, or for larger payloads, inside the carriages themselves. It was preferable for these payroll wagons to travel by day when possible, but when schedules were tight, the shipments would often be moving under the light of the moon. It was on a night such as this, while sitting guard on a wagon moving a shipment of gold bound for the chalk mines at Hertfordshire, that John Hastings lost his life.
Report of the violent and bloody robbery in which John Hastings was killed was made to officers of Edward Lloyd's British Marine insurance firm, the company that covered this particular transport and would later become Lloyd's of London. The report was made by a young hired guard named Henry Strap, who'd been thrown from his horse when the attack began, crawling under the payroll wagon and lifting himself into the undercarriage and suspension system of the large, heavy vehicle to hide. His report, which was dictated to and written down by an insurance barrister, can still be found in the Lloyd's of London archive rooms. Reads as follows.
Just as I had scurried into the thoroughbraces beneath the coach, the shooting ceased. From my vantage I could well make out 10 of our company dead or dying upon the ground. Our company's horses had run off during the mayhem, but I could hear 3 men draw close and dismount from their own steeds. One of the highwaymen, whom I could tell from my view of his legs and boots, was much smaller than were the others, and I took him to be but a lad. He pulled from his belt a pistol and stood over one of our company, Mr. Hastings, the carriage guard, who was severely wounded and attempting to crawl away. The boy fired a shot into the back of the poor man's head, killing him most unworthily. The boy traded over his weapon to one of his companions in exchange for another fully loaded, then walked to a second of our troop, who was mortally wounded and moaning sorrowfully. The boy put a ball into the head of this next unfortunate man. He then pulled the paymaster, Mr. Ranson, who was inside the carriage pleading for his life, out onto the dirt, pushing him to his knees. My eyes met for a fearful moment with Mr. Ranson's, whose comportment was one of pure terror. I was horrified he might give away my presence with his gaze, but before that could happen, the boy drew a knife and slit the man's throat, as if there were no more thought to it than the slicing of an apple. I witnessed all of this as I held myself tight against the underside of the carriage, daring not a breath. I could make out that one of the larger men had climbed atop the driver's pew and thrown down the strong box. That's when I heard for the first time the voice of the boy, only it was no boy at all. It was a woman. She was wrapped in a long cape, but I could see plainly above her high boots that she wore men's breeches. She said simply, "Open it." The second of her thieving companions hit the lock securing the money chest with the pommel of a long knife. After 3 blows, the lock gave way, and the box was breached. I was, of course, not privy to the amount of coin held within when we departed for Hertfordshire, but as the woman lifted pouch after pouch from within and secured them in a saddle pack, I could tell 'twas quite a weighty sum. After retrieving up the bounty, the woman said, "Tomorrow night we'll settle up." Her 2 companions never uttered a word. All three took to their mounts and departed in as many different directions. I remained still until the sound of their horses seemed a fair distance off. Then I emerged quietly from beneath the coach, checked closely my fellows to ascertain if any still breathed, then walked to the small village of Hatfield, 3 miles and a bit, where I secured the local constable, who carried me back here to London, arriving just after dawn hence. Then straight away to report the incident to you gentlemen. In all we were 11 dead, including the paymaster and bondsman. I alone survived to tell this telling. This is my sworn account of the events of last evening, 11 June, the year of our Lord, 1657. May God strike me dead if a single utterance herein be a lie. Henry Strapp, Private Guardsman.
What a shock it must have been to the insurance adjusters to hear that the leader of this ruthless band of highwaymen was a woman, and that this woman was so quick to murder outright in such a cold-hearted manner. But it would not be the last they would hear of this female marauder. She would become notorious over the next few years as the Wicked Lady Skelton, a name that would strike terror in the hearts of local villagers and business concerns from London to Hertfordshire and beyond. An Old English derivative of skeleton, a symbol of death, as in the Grim Reaper. She would earn this dreadful moniker 100 times over by her horrific actions. The term highwayman was planted on the likes of some of the most notorious robbers of the mid-17th century. These men included some of noble birth, cast upon hard times during the British Civil War, when the seizure of wealth and property from the country's richest families was ordered by Oliver Cromwell and the radical British Parliament. King Charles I had been beheaded, and noblemen and royalists who refused to swear allegiance to his new order were hunted down and imprisoned in the Tower of London, or worse. The bandits were also known as gentlemen of the road, or road agents, and would waylay travelers by standing in the middle of the road with pistols and swords drawn, crying out, "Stand and deliver," or "Show up your hands," often with a "please" or "if you don't mind" attached to the order. These rogues were nothing new to Great Britain. Highwaymen had been the bane of travelers for years, but during the English Civil War, they became much more numerous and pesky, but not murderous as a whole. But when the robber was the Wicked Lady Skelton, things usually became deadly, and any semblance of gentlemanly manners was thrown to the wind. She was no gentleman, and certainly no lady. As our listeners will soon find out, this woman killed so often and with such disregard for any common decency, the term serial killer fits her like one of her tailored leather gloves.
Her true identity, it would be discovered after 3 years of untethered violence at her whim, was Catherine Ferrers. The Ferrers family had long been one of the nobility of Hertfordshire, gaining lands through favor with first Henry VIII and later King Edward VI, probably as reward for their staunch support of the Protestant faith and their fervent anti-Catholic sentiments. Catherine was born in 1634 into a world of wealth and privilege, and soon took up her aristocratic family's political stance, a Royalist to the bone. Growing up, she was not a very likable child. As was said after her death by one of her childhood nannies, the girl had a cruelty of nature that garnered her few admirers. Neither kin nor pet nor barnyard creature was safe from it. We can only imagine just what form these cruel behaviors took, but it's evident that people saw Catherine as a bad seed. After the death of her father, her mother remarried, and, unable to tolerate the girl's attitude, her stepfather married her off at the age of 14 to one of his nephews, Thomas Fanshawe, who was himself only 16 years of age. The marriage seems to have been a happy one, and as the years went on, it appears Catherine actually came to love her husband, though, as you will see, true loyalty was not her strong suit. Some say Thomas had a soothing effect over her nature. Others state that he basically gave in to her every wish and mood, and spoiled her to no end. probably just to keep her from raging away at the drop of a hat. For a time, Catherine led a happy life as a true aristocrat. Parties and balls, card-playing and horses. She was content with this life. But that contentment would turn to rage very shortly when the king was overthrown and murdered, and Oliver Cromwell came to power in England. There was a 17-year-old girl who came to work for Catherine as a lady's maid just after the overthrow of the monarchy. Her name was Anne Meadows. What made Anne unique was the fact that she could read and write, a skill which was almost unheard of among servant-class girls at that time. Whether or not she held her literacy a secret is impossible to say, but she did keep a series of hidden diaries during her time in the Ferrers household, and long after her death, Anne's son found them among his mother's belongings and handed them over to the Royal Historical Society in 1718. These diaries proved an up-close and personal insight into the comings and goings during her reign as a robber and murderer of Catherine Ferrers, a.k.a. the Wicked Lady Skelton. Anne Meadows, for the betterment of history and our knowledge of Catherine Ferrers, was a bit of a curious cat, and her diaries are rich in the small intrigues she carried out against her mistress. One would easily assume that Catherine was a tyrannical boss, and it seems only natural that her servants would hold her in small regard. In any case, they all seemed to be spying on her at every turn. If she really believed she was keeping her bandit life a secret, she was delusional to a fault. The following diary entry coincides with a later robbery and slaughter, much like the one related to Lloyd's on June 11th by Henry Strapp. This robbery happened on July 14th and was also investigated by the Lloyd's adjusters. Anne makes mention in this passage that Catherine's husband, Thomas, is being held in the Tower of London at this time. We'll address this further a bit later in the podcast. The diary for this night reads as follows.
Lady Catherine returned home this eve long after midnight. She came through the hidden staircase from the garden side of the house, just as she had 4 weeks hence. She believes none of the servants was aware of that late-night excursion, but she's wrong. She was dressed tonight in the same riding accoutrements as when she last went out late a horse. Nothing like the plain skirt she wears for day riding. Boys' breeches, a close tunic and belt, high boots, long gauntlets, and a plumed hat, all as dark as her favourite steed, the black Frisian that she rides after the sun falls, as if to make her a shadow against the night. Is she perhaps hoping to be taken for a man against any who would otherwise molest a female riding alone at such a late hour? It may be so, but her stature and bearing, no matter the clothing, would easily give her away to any who sought to look closely. Hal, the stable boy, tells me her horse was wet of back when she returned after last night. Obviously vigorous riding was the cause. She'd put him up herself on that night, but Hal related to me that he had been watching from the lofts. I will ask a report of him tomorrow as to the steed's condition this night. As in the time previous, tonight she was carrying a leather saddle pack that seemed very weighty, and it slowed her walk some. And in her belt, the flintlock pistol that belongs to her husband, who is slammed up in the tower. I watched her through the small peephole in my wall that I've dug out to keep watch of her exits and arrivals. After she moved beyond my sight, I could hear her climb the steps to the upper chambers. I gathered my robe and left my room to follow. If I were to be noticed, I would use the pretext that I wished to find out if she needed help preparing her bed. But in reality, I am simply, and I'm ashamed to admit it, spying upon her. Lady Catherine is a mystery to me. I bathe her and wash her privy clothes, even clean her monthly flannel, but she is so unknown to me, as she is to all of her household. Upon arriving in the upper hall and up to her husband's study, I slid behind a thick curtain and watched with clear advantage. She closed the door, but only a bit, and I witnessed her every movement. She took the pistol from her belt, wrapped it in a pouch, and placed it in a hidden cupboard within her husband's library shelves. Strange. It's no secret this pistol has a place in the weapons cabinet. Why would she hide it away? She placed the pack onto the writing table and retrieved from it 9 or 10 leather coin pouches. She untied the top of one, poured a few coins onto her hand. She allowed herself a quiet moment, then returned the coins to the pouch and hid them all with the pistol in the large secret cupboard. She next made exit to her room and closed the door behind her. My curiosity has piqued, but not so that I would dare sum up the bravery to examine closer the bounty she's hidden in the study. But I'm less than fully convinced that my inquisitive nature might not win out eventually.
The pay wagon robbery of July 14th, 1657, which coincides with Anne's diary entry, is well chronicled as one of the most brutal criminal endeavors in the history of the Highwaymen era. Reports of the slaughter that happened that night alarmed the Royal Exchange, now controlled by Parliament after the King's execution. It also alarmed the marine insurance agents to the highest point of their already feverish concerns. This was only Catherine's second raid, yet after this night her fame would be well known for the rest of time. The scene of the attack, come upon just hours after the fact by a group of travelers who happened upon the carnage, proved again a slaughter of unprecedented nature. Again there was only one survivor, this being Jane Hornsby, the 12-year-old daughter of a shoe merchant who was traveling with her nanny from London to meet up with her father in the village of Aldbury. For some reason, even with tales of armed bandits on the lips of everyone in the area, the merchant assumed this was the safest mode of travel for the girl. He couldn't have been more wrong. Jane's story, which was written about in the daily papers and pamphlets, including one which was distributed far and wide by the insurance firm, is a tale of pure horror, and made infamous for the first time the name of the Wicked Lady Skelton. The girl told authorities that the trip was uneventful for the first 4 hours after departing London, but only a short time after dark, shots were fired from the trees lining the road to Aldbury, with the driver and 2 of the wagon's mounted guards falling instantly dead. The team pulling the coach became startled, but were steadied by one of the guards. The guards returned fire, but a new volley of shot and ball came from the other side of the road, and 2 more fell wounded, along with the bondsman, who was shot through the head and fell from his seat atop the wagon, dead. According to Jane, a woman's voice then rang out from the darkness of the tree line.
"Throw down, and none other shall die."
The 4 remaining guards threw their pistols to the ground. No sooner had they done so than a new volley of shot came from both sides of the road, and the remaining guards all fell from their saddles. Then, quiet. Now the shooters emerged from the trees on horseback, 7 in all, with 3 dismounting as they reached the onslaught they had produced. Jane reported that she and her nanny lay trembling on the floor of the wagon. Suddenly, the single door of the carriage opened behind them. There, Jane said, stood a figure that, though small in stature, looked nonetheless menacing, with a heavy cape over her shoulders, a plumed riding hat, the bottom half of her face covered in a dark wrapped scarf, and holding a pistol. Seeing as the passengers were only a single servant and a young girl, the woman lowered the weapon and ordered them both out. It would appear from reading Jane's report that Catherine had added to her gang by this point, as Henry Strapp had only reported 2 men with her on June 11th. One wonders why the larger force. Jane reports,
Nanny fell straight to the ground. I remember going numb, unable to cry or speak a word. It felt after as though I'd entered a nightmare. The woman turned away at the sound of one of our guards, still alive, moaning softly nearby. She ordered her men to hold him up against the forward wheel. This was done, and she grabbed another flintlock from one of her fellows who stood by. She knelt and hissed into the dying man's ear. "You ride for Cromwell? You ride to hell." She then put the barrel of the weapon in the man's mouth and pulled the trigger. I jumped at the explosion. The back of his head flew apart, splattering blood and what other human material I know not upon the wagon, and a great deal on myself. I felt it fall upon my face and in my mouth, and I was forced to wipe away a large amount which stung at my eyes. Upon the woman's order, the coin pouches from both strong boxes we carried were placed within leather bags. Then the robbers all mounted up and rode off. The lady sat alone, straddling her saddle in the male fashion upon a black Frisian. She looked down on me and said clearly and with no more feeling than if she was ordering brisket from the butcher's. She said, "Stick by the wagon. Someone will be along after sunrise. Tell them that you've had the honour of shaking hands with the Lady Skelton." Then, as sudden as she had appeared, she vanished into the woods, never gazing back, like a spirit.
There are many theories among historians as to what drove Catherine Ferrers, a lady of the aristocracy, into a life of murder and banditry. But the reason most feel plainly evident was the formation of a system known as the Protectorate, when Parliament did away with the king and Oliver Cromwell was given power over the country. The English civil wars ended in 1651, after which wealthy landowners known as cavaliers were targeted for ruin or worse, unless they swore loyalty to Cromwell and the Roundheads. These Royalist supporters had to forfeit many of the rights and privileges they had been accustomed to for centuries. A rebellion began, and Catherine's husband Thomas, an outspoken supporter of the monarchy, took command of a small army of Royalist rebels who were fighting skirmishes around Herefordshire. But Thomas, brave as he was no leader, and in short order Cromwell's men had run down and slain most of the rebels. Thomas himself was captured and sent to the Tower of London. Had it not been for the fact that Catherine had yet a few relatives in high positions who had sworn allegiance to Cromwell, her house and lands would have been forfeit to Parliament altogether. As it was, she was blocked from accessing her fortune, which was always kept in the London Royal Exchange. And to make matters worse, the taxes on her estate were raised to nearly twice what they had been before the war, and she was prohibited from collecting rents from her tenant farmers. If they couldn't put her out directly, they could make it impossible for her to remain. The Protectorate would have her estates one way or another. It assumed that, after these insults, the bad seed returned in full force in the shape of a grown woman who would vow to take her revenge upon the powers that be. She was not about to become a pauper and would, from then on out, simply take whatever she needed to keep her in the style to which she was accustomed. And if she could feed into her obviously emerging bloodlust while she was at it, all the better. Whatever torments she had exercised on her young cousins, pets, and farm animals as a child, these urges seemed to have now returned with a vengeance. When Jane described how it seemed that, just before executing the nanny, the Wicked Lady Skelton was listening to commands from within her brain, a trait was exhibited not unfamiliar to those who study the habits and mannerisms of modern-day serial killers. And the terrifying part at this point, Catherine had only just begun.
September 1659. Oliver Cromwell died, and many assumed the political climate might start to move back in favor of the monarchy. But politics was not really the motivating factor for Catherine Ferrers. Revenge was what fed her bloodlust. The female highwaymen, now known as far away as Scotland, Wales, and Cornwall, and gaining infamy on the continent as well as the Wicked Lady Skelton, was thought to be responsible for the deaths of more than 50 people. Many of these deaths occurred as she shifted for a time from pay wagons to passenger carriers. She and her cohorts would stop the carriages, demand the passengers hand over their valuables, coin and jewelry, and if anyone resisted even for a moment, Lady Skelton would shoot that person without hesitation. A reward was placed on her head in the amount of £5,000, the equivalent of over £500,000 today, or nearly $670,000 US. She was now big news, and newspapers were running daily updates on the hunt for this ruthless killer. Though movies, books, and magazine articles have sought to romanticize Catherine Ferrers as some sort of feminist icon, the truth is, Lady Skelton was nothing more than a cold-blooded murderer who killed and robbed at her leisure. During her time, she was not looked upon as a Robin Hood, steal from the rich and give to the poor type outlaw. The money she stole was often meant to pay hard-working laborers, and the wagon guards and innocent travelers she murdered were not wealthy, cigar-smoking fat men. They were common people, their lives being taken by one who seemed even more greedy than the rich business interests she robbed, and her score of dead was mounting almost daily. After a time, Catherine seems no longer to have needed robbery as an excuse to kill. When her husband Thomas was refused release from the Tower on pardon, the policeman who was heading up the Board of Paroles and signed the papers of denial was shot dead in full daylight on the front steps of his own home, in view of his children who were greeting him out the door. Witnesses said it was a masked woman in men's clothing that fired the deadly shots. From pistols she held one in each hand. She rode off into the woods before anyone had time to follow. A few nights later, the house of a government commissioner who had ordered the execution of 12 Loyalist rebels who'd attempted to raid an army garrison just outside Hertfordshire, where stores of gunpowder and weapons were held, was set on fire, and he, his wife, and his 6 children all perished in the blaze. 3 people in dark cloaks were seen riding away from the fire. The sinister laughter of a woman was heard as they went. A week later, 25 head of cattle were shot in the fields of a local tax collector who often took cows, pigs, and other livestock in lieu of coin to pay off tax debts. And on one especially horrific night, the mayor of the market town of Hitchin was pulled, along with his wife, from his home by 4 masked riders and hung from an oak tree until he strangled to death. The wife was dragged behind the horse of the marauders' leader, a woman who was heard yelling insults at the wife before releasing the rope and riding off with her comrades. Catherine was not a romantic figure. She was a serial killer, set apart from other serial killers only by virtue of the fact that she didn't sneak into bedrooms or kidnap her victims, murdering under stealth. She killed in front of witnesses. The money-hungry men who rode with her were not much better, but it's obvious that Catherine took a unique pleasure in killing, and the craving for power over life and death is one of the qualifying factors in modern FBI psychological profiling of serial killers. Catherine was a clear sociopath. She gave the orders. She murdered close up. She was the name associated with this terror. Thus, bringing her to justice became a goal for the common man and the wealthy business class alike. She was, in short, an evil human being.
September 1659. Again my mistress returned home at a very late hour. She was not alone. The tall gentleman she has had to dinner on many occasions, whom all of the staff know shares her bed many a night, was with her. Both appeared agitated, and all the worse for wear. There is no doubt in my mind at this point as to what Lady Catherine has been up to. She is the one they are calling the Wicked Lady Skelton. I'm positive of this now. I would make report to the authorities at once, were it not for the fact that I'd be cast out into the wilderness if she were arrested. I would once again become a wretched pauper, wandering in search of sustenance. I cannot be the agent of my own misery in such a way. Yet, if she is the responsible party of the deeds being reported daily, murder, mayhem, how can I remain silent? How can I call myself a Christian woman while remaining mute, while she goes on and on, devastating so many lives? I have searched my soul and decided. Tonight I will gain further information to use in my rebuke of her. If I am to betray her, I must have enough knowledge to procure for myself guarantees from the magistrate that I'll be compensated and set up elsewhere. I have searched my soul for an answer, and I believe this is the way.
The man Ann Meadows was referring to was Ralph Chaplin, a wealthy Hertfordshire farmer who was later determined to be Catherine's main accomplice and partner, and according to Anne's diary, her lover. Some historians have stated that she and Chaplin may have had a child together, but the timeline of her career simply doesn't support this. Anne would surely have written about any baby being born, and Catherine's criminal activity never ceased during the few years she and Chaplin were together, nor had anyone ever reported being robbed by a pregnant woman. Anne waited until Catherine and Chaplin were both well into the upper chambers of the house before sidling upstairs on one of her spying missions. As she approached the door to Catherine's room, she could plainly hear the two speaking, both their voices reaching a louder pitch, as she termed it, as they talked about the events of that evening. It appears they attempted to rob a shipment of weapons and supplies headed to a garrison housing troops of what Parliament had dubbed the New Model Army. The Highwaymen had underestimated the strength of support guarding the wagon, and were surprised when a contingent of cavalry appeared suddenly from the woods and pursued the outlaws. 2 of the bandit gang were killed, and Catherine and Chaplin barely escaped capture. The argument they were now having behind closed doors concerned Chaplin's wanting to cease their nocturnal thievery after the close call of that night, and Catherine's determined stance that they continue at all costs. Anne wrote that her mistress was seething at Chaplin's suggestion they stop. She called him a coward, and said she would gladly go on without him if he hadn't the stomach for it. Anne just did find cover behind a curtain as Chaplin swung open the door and stormed out of the house. She wrote in her diary that Catherine commenced to throwing things around the room, and like a temperamental child, produced a knife and began ripping into her bed sheets and tapestries. Through the now open door, Anne watched as Catherine pushed open her window and yelled obscenities at Chaplin as he rode away, tears of anger and rage falling from her eyes. From that moment on, Anne wrote, Lady Catherine became completely unhinged. What happened the next day only added to her psychotic behavior. As Ralph Chaplin rode into Finchley Common in Middlesex to meet with his barrister, he was approached by a company of soldiers who demanded he go with them to answer questions about the attempted robbery the night before. He made a break for it and was shot down in the street, dying instantly. No one knows who betrayed the man, or why Catherine was not given up as well. Some historians believe that one of the robbers who was killed during the raid on the military wagon named Chaplin with his last breath, but simply died before naming Catherine. Perhaps, but we will never know for sure.
Not long after Chaplin was killed, Catherine Ferrers put together another, much smaller gang and continued her activities for a full 9 months longer, this time sticking only to coach robberies and the occasional holdup of governmental officials and merchants. Her campaign to get Thomas freed from the Tower had become an expensive one, and she needed to maintain her thievery to keep up with the cost of paying barristers and bribing officials. Her desire to see him free was more than likely born out of a self-preservation than love. Her affair with Chaplin can attest to that. She was now getting desperate and taking chances she wouldn't have if Chaplin were still alive, including daytime robberies. On June 10, 1660, Catherine and 2 of her men stopped a pay wagon outside of No Man's Land Common in Wheathampstead. According to reports to police constables made by the coach guard sitting atop the strongbox, they came upon the bandits at 2 p.m. One of the robbers was a woman. She ordered the guard to toss his weapon and step down from the wagon. He refused. She asked him in a stern voice as she pointed her pistol directly at his head. "Do you know who I am?" "I do," said the guard. "You're the Lady Skelton. But makes no difference. You'll take this box over my dead body." Coolly, the woman pulled the trigger. But the gun backfired and blew off her thumb. In the confusion, her companions hesitated in firing, and the guard raised his rifle and shot the woman through the heart. She fell from her saddle, dead. The wagon driver and one of the passengers opened fire on the remaining 2 robbers, killing one and mortally wounding the second. The guard who had shot Catherine and gave the report was named John Hastings. He was the oldest son of the elder John Hastings, who was murdered almost 3 years to the day during the robbery of June 11, 1657. This John had taken over his father's job soon after that robbery, and the irony of this became the subject of conversation in public houses and family dinner tables for years to come. The reign of terror perpetrated by the female highwayman known as the Wicked Lady Skelton had come to an end. Catherine's body was retrieved by a few of her male servants, and her burial was organized by her lady's maid, Anne Meadows, as none of Catherine's family wanted anything to do with their notorious relative. Though her remains were buried there, Catherine's house and lands were forfeit to Parliament, and her burial site has long since been covered over by Mother Nature. And no one is quite sure exactly where it is on the former estate. Catherine Ferrers was 26 years old when she died, but her legend, for better or for worse, lives on to this day. I'm Julia Parker.
And I'm Stephen Savage. Fatal Gothic is written and researched by myself and Julia Parker and produced at Lunatopia Studios in Idlewild, California. The role of Anne Meadows was read by Lorna Brooks, and the role of Jane Hornsby was read by Matilda Brooks-Jones and recorded in Liverpool, UK. Fatal Gothic can be heard via Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, SoundCloud, Amazon Prime Music, and wherever you hear your favorite podcasts. Thanks for listening. And there you have it, Fatal Gothic, the Wicked Lady Skelton. Before we close out, we'd like to mention our guest actors for this episode. Lorna Brooks is who you heard in the role of Anne Meadows, and Matilda Brooks-Jones, one of my online acting students, as a matter of fact, gave her voice to the role of Jane Hornsby, both coming to us from Liverpool in the UK. So we hope you enjoyed the show, and we promise to bring more Fatal Gothic episodes your way as often as possible. And anything you'd like to add, Julia?
Yeah, only to say that we're happy to bring you this podcast and hope you'll spread the word and let others know about the show. Yeah, it really is a labor of love for Stephen and I.
And it truly is. So anyway, for Julia Parker and myself, thanks for listening, and we will see you next time. Thanks, Julia.
Bye, everyone.
Sunny, most of